Well, you can always tell when it's that Sunday summer when you get the JV team up here to give you the message. It seems to happen once every year. It reminds me of the first year that I coached high school baseball. I was mainly in charge of the ninth grade team. And our varsity got a last-minute invitation to go play at a tournament in LaGrange, Georgia. Well, the varsity had scheduled a game at Joe Davis Stadium with one of the big Huntsville teams. We didn't want to forfeit, so we gathered what was left of the JV team and the ninth grade team, and we went over to play this big Huntsville varsity team. And you could tell when we came out of that Joe Davis Stadium dugout that Huntsville looked at us and was looking for the varsity and quickly realized the varsity was nowhere to be found. So you could kind of imagine how they warmed up and how proud they were. And it started as you would imagine. The first few innings, they put it on us pretty good. And then they switched and put in their JVs. Well, our JVs and ninth graders caught up, and then we took the lead. And so the sixth inning, the Huntsville varsity coach put his starters back in. They had one kid that was going to Auburn to play. Well, you know how baseball goes with momentum. Our kids kept hitting. And we brought a ninth grader in that pitched the game of his life, or 2 innings of his life. And our JV and ninth graders walked out of Joe Davis Stadium with a victory over that big Huntsville varsity team. True story. Well, after this month of both of the Bradleys up here, I don't expect to replicate that performance. So, I can't exactly keep up with their pitching, but I'll do my best. Back in 1963, and you'll be familiar with the story if you've read any of Andy Andrews, specifically a little book he did called The Butterfly Effect. But back in 1963, there was a hypothesis that was delivered by a scientist by the name of Edward Lorenz, and it was about this butterfly effect. And he argued that a butterfly could flap its wings on one side of the world and set molecules of air in motion, which could then move other molecules of air, and this cumulative chain reaction had the potential to create a hurricane on the other side of the planet. Now, again, don't worry, I'm a history teacher, so I'm not going to try to explain this, but he was laughed out of the building. Impossible, they said. And then, by the mid-90s, a lot of physics professors came up with something that sounded very similar. They called it the law of sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. So remember that for the test later. The law of sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. And they proved that this assumption or this theory actually had some truth, that a small impact on the initial conditions of a situation could greatly alter or change the outcome in another location. No doubt several years ago, you all mourned the death of one of the most important historical figures that has ever lived, Norman Borlaug. Correct, yes. We all remember Norman. Don't worry, I must have been that asleep that day in history too. But Norman Borlaug passed away probably in the last 10 years. But Norman Borlaug has been credited for saving the lives of possibly as many as 2 billion people. Okay, there's just about 6 to 7 on this planet, so that's an astronomical number. Norman possibly saved as many as 2 billion people because the scientists produced this hybrid of corn and wheat that could grow in these dry, arid climates. So he brought food and he brought vegetation to regions that formerly had never seen them. So we think that over the decades, and of course as people continue to reproduce and have more children, that possibly 2 billion people could have been saved from starvation. So maybe we should give Norman Borlaug this unbelievable credit for the 2 billion. And of course they gave him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. But you can't give all the credit to Norman Borlaug because Norman Borlaug never would have invented that hybrid if not for FDR's vice president, Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace had a particular interest in agriculture. That was once his cabinet position. And it was Wallace who set aside the funding for Norman Borlaug to create this hybrid. So maybe we really should give part of that credit back to Henry Wallace. But then Henry Wallace would say that he never would have had this unbelievable interest in agriculture and the ability to save if not for a role model that he learned from and that he followed around. His father was a professor, and so his father allowed young Henry Wallace to travel around with one of his star students. His star student's name was George Washington Carver. So Wallace would grow up saying that it was George Washington Carver that led him to pursue these interests. So maybe you go back and give credit for the $2 billion to Carver. But then again, there's that brief, somewhat insignificant moment in history when George Washington Carver was just a baby. And this was pre-Civil War. He was born into slavery, and his mother and he were both captured in the night by a bunch of raiders. A local family had befriended George Washington Carver and his mother, and they were so distraught about the news that this small farmer by the name of Moses Carver traveled into the night with his horse to track down these raiders. After finding out that George Washington's mother had been killed, he begged for the child, and he made a deal with those raiders. He gave the only horse that he had for a burlap sack, and the raiders dropped the bag at the feet of Moses Carver. He opened up the bag, and of course there was the little baby, George Washington Carver. And so this Carver family adopted George Washington Carver and decided that he would go and be educated, that he would be put in a position to make a difference. So maybe you credit 2 billion lives to a little farmer by the name of Moses Carver that was willing to risk everything to get back this child. See, if we think about it, we see this butterfly effect happen in Scripture. You know, whether you call it a butterfly effect, whether you call it a ripple effect, a chain reaction, or just the divine providence of God. No matter how hard we try to diminish our mortal values, the truth is this: God has big plans for each and every one of us. And because of that, we matter. We matter to the present. We matter to generations that come. We matter whether we really want to matter or not. You know, that's always the disturbing thing when, in the line of work I'm in, you have some that just want to fly under the radar. And we as adults, we can be the same way. You know, we don't want to be noticed. Just fly under the radar. Just let me do my thing. I'm not going to bother anybody. But I think we see here that in itself is too problematic. In Psalms 112, 1 and 2, again, we see this information here that, in fact, there is this ripple effect. It says, "How blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who greatly delights in his commandments. His descendants will be mighty on earth. The generation of the upright will be blessed. Wealth and riches are in his house, and his righteousness endures forever." We have countless examples that both the good and, unfortunately, the bad follow men through generations. The bad can come back to haunt the descendants. Of course, the good can continue to bless for generations. In my history class that I teach, sometimes we like to contemplate some of the what-ifs of history. You know, what if the Nile River did not flood on a routine basis? You know, would there have been an Egyptian civilization? What if the Persians had actually destroyed the Greeks at Marathon or Salamis? What if Rome had never fallen? What if President Lincoln had not been assassinated before Reconstruction? What if this British World War I private by the name of Henry Tandy, who had a young German soldier in his sights during one battle by the name of Adolf Hitler, what if he would have pulled the trigger? You know, we have all of these what-ifs. How significant the smallest actions can build some of the biggest chain reactions or outcomes. Of course, these conversations are merely just speculations. But when it comes to the purpose God has instilled in all of us, again, the Bible offers countless examples of these life-altering encounters that transcend mere matters of speculation. There's no doubt that God's power is infinite, and He can do whatever He wants. He doesn't really need me to defeat the forces of evil in the world and save the world. He did that through His Son. But even though He may not necessarily need us to be these pivotal difference makers in the butterfly effect of His providence, He sure does want us to be. He wants us to be the difference makers. God is perfect, so what's really left for Him to prove? We, His children, on the other hand, have everything left to prove. Once again, we see the father-child relationship as the best explanation of His love and our purpose. So many times when we're questioning God and sometimes the way that He conducts Himself, or the way He makes decisions, we see that the best explanation goes back to this father-child relationship. There are so many things that we can do for our children. In fact, they learn quickly because there are so many things they will sit back and allow us to do for them. But as parents, most of us anyway, don't want them forever dependent on us. With every stage of growth, we pull back a few more restraints and we push them to a greater level of independence. Teenagers, these same parents that treat your departure to college like a death in the family, strangely enough, they don't necessarily celebrate your return after college when you come back to move back in. Okay? Trust me, I know from experience. My father started building another bathroom to give me the hint that it was time for me to move out, that I had taken up his bathroom that he had claimed while I was gone. And my mother started dropping these not-so-subtle hints about how I should really start ironing my own clothes. Don't judge me, we took care of this a few years ago, okay? But the point is, our Heavenly Father gave us the freedom to make our own decisions, the ability to do the work of Christ on earth, the importance to matter, again, whether we want to or not, because He wants us to grow in Christian maturity. Although He wants us to be forever dependent on His sovereign guidance, He's entrusted us to be the stewards of His creation and the purpose-driven body that was established by His Son. You know, the growth of the church in the early centuries is one of the most remarkable examples of God using His people to accomplish His will for mankind. The secular historians, the non-believers that try to make sense of this remarkable growth of early Christianity, they come up with all kinds of people to give the credit to, all kinds of Norman Borlaugs or even George Washington Carvers to give credit to. They estimate that by the late 4th century, once Christianity had been legalized and eventually made the official religion of the Roman Empire, there could have been anywhere between 10 and 35 million Christians, again, by the 4th century. So the researchers of academia often like to speculate, okay, who played the biggest role? Secular historians will give credit to emperors like Constantine and Theodosius for making Christianity legal and then eventually the official religion of Rome. But before we give too much credit to any Romans, perhaps the enormous Christian population we actually should give credit to Irenaeus. Irenaeus lived during the 2nd century, and it was his writings, it was his work that stamped out a lot of the early heresies. He provided some of the most compelling explanations to prove that the 27 books that we now consider the New Testament, that they were indeed the inspired Word of God in the canon. So maybe we should give credit to Irenaeus for the growth of this church. But Irenaeus would never have been in that position without his teacher. Most scholars agree that his teacher was none other than Polycarp. Polycarp took on the Gnostic heresy in the early 2nd century, and he was one of the most significant church fathers in the 2nd generation of Christians. So maybe this teacher of Irenaeus should receive credit for taking the torch from the first apostles and providing leadership into the second century. But if Polycarp was a church father of the second generation of Christians, this means that he had to learn from one of the original apostles. Who did Polycarp learn from? Well, the Apostle John. We know that John likely accounted for 5 books of the New Testament. He was the apostle, of course, that Christ loved, and he outlived the others. So maybe he should receive the most credit for this population explosion of Christians. So what does John say about this? If you go to the opening passage of the Gospel of John, John chapter 1, verse 1, he tells us exactly where the source of this huge explosion of the Christian population, where it comes from. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. See, the darkness of secularism, it still doesn't comprehend Christ as the original source of light. In fact, if you read a lot of the Western Civ books that I have to teach out of, most secular historians describe Jesus as a revolutionary Jewish teacher who was put to death, and they often cast Paul as the biggest contributor to the growth of Christianity. They like to give Paul all this credit. And no one can question his track record. By the end of the first century, some scholars estimate that there were as many as 500,000 Christians. So when you consider his missionary journeys, the tens of thousands of miles that he traveled, the 13 New Testament books that he authored, there's no doubt that he played an extremely important role. But then again, how far would Paul have gotten without the help of Ananias of Damascus? We read in Acts chapter 9, if you look around verse 13, that Ananias had heard from many about Saul, how much harm he had done to the early saints in Jerusalem, and that Saul had given authority by the chief priest to bind all who call on the name of Christ. Ananias knew that Saul was a man to be feared. Ananias knew that his very life might well be threatened by Saul. So what sent Ananias to find Saul? After this initial, very well-founded concern, and you have to wonder, did he think he was walking into a trap? Was he concerned about that? So what sent him to seek out this persecutor of Christians? The same source that John contributed as the beginning point, and that, of course, is Jesus. In verse 11 of this same chapter, Acts 9, we read that Ananias received a vision. So the Lord said to him, "Arise and go to the street called Straight, and inquire at the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus. For behold, he is praying, and in a vision he has seen a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him, so that he may receive his sight." And then if you skip down to verse 15, it reads, "But the Lord said to him, Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine, to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake." You know, sometimes we wonder, why didn't Christ just go ahead and fulfill this full conversion of Saul on the road to Damascus? He certainly could have done anything he wanted to. Why did Christ appear to Saul, blind Saul, but then leave Saul and Ananias to finish out this conversion? Even though Christ could have done this on his own, again, he wanted Ananias to finish what he started. He wanted Ananias to finish what Christ started. Just like he wants us to play the part in converting the world. So when the secular world identifies Paul as the difference maker, aren't they really admitting that a Roman citizen and Christian persecutor, that he voluntarily changed from the hunter to the hunted? Knowing it would lead to a lifetime of persecution and eventually his own death, in making Paul the central focus, as a lot of the secular world does, aren't they really proving that something powerful had to have changed Paul? You see, the original butterfly that flapped his wings and caused this chain reaction, it was just the hand of Christ. He blinded Saul on the road to Damascus. He called Ananias to restore Saul's vision and baptize him. And he inspired John to follow in his footsteps. That's the source. When you trace the ripple effect, the source is always Christ. Of course, always the question for us is, are we going to carry on the message? Are we going to pick up where he has left off? Maybe it's not so much a ripple or a flow of air molecules. Maybe it's something that's a lot more powerful. If you think about the night sky, and scientists tell us, and I take their word for it, scientists tell us that the starlight that we see has traveled millions of miles just to come into our nightly view. We know that we're looking at starlight that actually originated well before we were born on this earth. So how powerful then is this eternal light of Christ that we just sang about? Can you imagine what the scene must have been like when Moses Carver, when he rescued the baby George Washington Carver from that dark bag? Could you imagine if that bag had been opened as it was? Did it shed light on the face of the child? Was it blinding for the child, like the light from heaven that blinded Saul on the road to Damascus? Maybe it was more of the light of a rebirth, like when Ananias opened Paul's blinded eyes to receive sight once more. For the chain reaction of fortunate events that would one day prepare Norman Borlaug to save as many as 2 billion people, perhaps the light that shined on that little baby was once again what John referenced as life. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Again, God can send his light wherever he wants, but he wants us to be the transmitters of the light. Remember what Christ said in Matthew 5:14 through 16. He says, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." So you see, we matter whether we want to shine or not. Unfortunately, this opposite effect, the world of shadows, the world of darkness, it has an ongoing trail as well, a trail of misery, a trail of death, a trail of destruction, and mankind continues to suffer from the darkness that is spread by some. If we spread this darkness, how many people will suffer? But on the other hand, if we spread the light of life that Christ first shed on us, how many billions can we save? This morning, I'll bring it to a close so the JV team will let you go to lunch early enough. But I will say, if you haven't been letting your light shine, think of the impact you're not having. And think of all the possible millions or billions that could benefit from your light. Again, with Christ, all things are possible. If you have any concerns today, if you're not a child of God, or if you have some things to fix, the invitation is open. Please come forward as we stand and sing.